Great. Well, hello everyone. My name is Mandy Graham. I'm a member of the events team at Sustainable Prosperity Action Group, which is a small but mighty grassroots group of activists based here on Kaurna land in Adelaide. And we campaign for urgent climate action and improving economic and social justice for Australians. I'd like to welcome you this evening to our Monday night Zoom talk featuring Kaj Lofgren. Kaj's very generously donated his time to chat to us this evening about Regen Melbourne, which is a very exciting new project that looks to Melbourne's future. Before I introduce Kaj, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Kaurna land on which we meet tonight and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I also acknowledge that the sovereignty of the land that we meet on was never ceded and that this land was and always will be Aboriginal land. So for anyone joining us outside Adelaide, as Gabby said before, if you want to put in the chat the land that you're coming from, that would be great. And also send us a greeting. You can use the chat to do that. And before we begin, I'd like to introduce Gabby. I'm sure most people know her. Hi, Gabby.
Hello.
She's the chief organiser of everything at Sustainable Prosperity, or SPAG as we affectionately call the group. And she's the tech wizard this evening. So if you've got any tech problems, just message Gabby in the chat and I'm sure she'll be able to help you out there. If you've got a question too, if you can type that directly in the chat, that would be fantastic, because we're going to stop for some questions later. And Kai's already said that he really enjoys responding to questions. And we know that if we're answering your questions, we'll be talking about the things that the group wants to talk about tonight. So please put any number of questions in the chat as we go. The topic of our talk tonight is exploring Regen Melbourne. And as I said before, our presenter is Kaj Lofgren. To give you a bit of background on Kaj, he's the head of strategy at Small Giants Academy. He leads the Academy's strategy around education and storytelling initiatives, including the Impact Safari program and the Mastery of Business and Empathy. Kaj previously worked across the Small Giants family office portfolio, including with Impact Investment Group, the School of Life Australia and Dumbo Feather. And I urge you to take a look at the Small Giants Academy website, because it gives you a really broad indication of all the different things that Kai's involved with, and they're very, very fascinating. Kai's also a director at Type Human, which explores how emerging technology is affecting human dignity in public life. Kai's recently returned from study leave at Lund University, where he completed a Masters of Economic History. And he also holds a Bachelor of Engineering in Civil Engineering and a Bachelor of Arts in History. And he's previously worked with Engineers Without Borders and Engineers Australia. He's also written lots and lots of articles on a broad range of topics. So looking at the breadth of Kai's work and his involvement in and initiation of human-centred projects, it's not surprising that he's a big part of Regen Melbourne, which is the topic of our conversation tonight. Regen Melbourne is a network of more than 40 organisations and 600 individuals exploring a regenerative, gee, that's a tricky word, future for Melbourne, using 6 months of rigorous community engagement and countless hours of data analysis combined with Doughnut Economics theory. They've developed a new compass for Melbourne. So to hear more about this exciting project, I'll hand you over to Kaj. Thanks, Kaj.
Thanks, Mandy, and thanks for having me, everyone. It's quite a mouthful of an introduction, really, and I always think I'm not that old, and so my career isn't that long. But when you rattle all the things off, there's a lot of hindsight strategy that goes into personal narrative, I think, but it was a bit messier than perhaps that sounded. I am a recovering engineer. That's how I like to describe myself. I worked in my first part of my career at Engineers Without Borders, which was my way of reconciling a deep sort of social justice, progressive upbringing with what was an incredibly conservative, conservative education. Went to Melbourne Uni. I did civil engineering. It was very, very white, very conservative, extraordinarily wealthy at the time. It was the mining boom, and so it was sort of the golden faculty and where you went when you were told you were clever at school, I guess. I sort of did a history major in an arts degree because I thought that would be a way of sort of complementing my engineering back in the day when you could do double degrees. And I guess I was really struggling with the lack of context in my engineering education. So I found Engineers Without Borders, and it provided me a kind of justification to remain and finish my engineering studies. Although it did take quite a long time because I was spending more time with Engineers Without Borders than I was with my studies. I then spent a bit of a time with Engineers Without Borders helping to build that in Australia, and then eventually stepped across to a family office called Small Giants. And I feel like this story, it's sort of important to the way we landed on Regen Melbourne about 12 months ago. So I'll just give you a quick brief of that, and then we can jump into some of the sort of the detail of the last 12 months. And the Small Giants world was really, it was an attempt to create a portfolio of initiatives using significant inherited wealth to build a portfolio that could demonstrate, social and environmental values in the world, but also try and prove a theory of change to other people with wealth that they could and should do the same. So it was kind of a deliberate attempt to create that sort of avalanche of capital into what we talk about as the next economy. And we were doing that for a few years. We were experimental. We were investing in a whole lot of different things, from the philanthropic end all the way through to the commercial end, and doing that quite successfully, as it turns out. And a few people started coming to us and asking for support. And so we built a funds management organization that would take that theory of change and scale it. And so we set up something called the Impact Investment Group, which has done that really well over the last few years. And the interesting part of that, I guess, is that we were never that interested in capital in the first place. So we found ourselves in a position, those of us at the center of Small Giants, with an inherited wealth that we wanted to try and use for good. But ultimately, we were actually really passionate about education, the power of storytelling, and ultimately the power of community convening or community organizing. And so when the funds management organization started to do what they did at some scale, we had a lot more time on our hands to be a little bit more strategic about those other areas, those other levers of change. So we put together something called the Small Giants Academy, which is our attempt to do this in a strategic and quite targeted way. So the Small Giants Academy is a non-profit media and education initiative. There's about 10 staff, I think, at the last count. And we run short courses and long courses that try to put empathy back at the heart of leadership, and really try and train particularly people who are working as leaders in organizations and in businesses to lead in a more holistic way that can integrate many of the values that I'm sure we all share on this call. And then we also tell stories about that. So we have a magazine, as was Mandy mentioned, called Dumbo Feather, which tells extraordinary stories. That was when we met Kate Rayworth for the first time 6-7 years ago when I interviewed her for Dumbo Feather. And a whole bunch of other storytelling avenues, podcasts, films, etc. And then when the pandemic hit, I guess I was given the opportunity by Small Giants, which I'm very grateful for, to start exploring what this community convening or community organizing aspect of our work could look like. So we set up a whole bunch of forums, all online, all on Zoom, to explore various sectors of the economy that we wanted to start to affect in a more community-oriented way, rather than just in an initiative-by-initiative way. So we had forums on jobs and the economy. We had forums on clean energy. We had forums on healthy society, and pulled together health professionals. So we had all these different forums going on, and we started to sort of understand, I guess, the power of the network that we built over the last decade in tilting that network towards, the great, quite apparent social and environmental challenges of our time. And so when we had a masterclass with Kate Rayworth and her husband, Roman Krasnarek, who I'd also highly recommend for his work, his philosophical work, we had a masterclass with them together at the Academy. This is almost exactly a year ago now. And in that masterclass, it was all on the theme of long-term thinking, which is Roman's area of work, and Doughnut Economics, which is, of course, Kate's area of work. So we had a session on long-term thinking and Doughnut Economics, which was fantastic. And we had people from all around Australia in that session. And it was on the back of the downscaling methodology that was produced out of Amsterdam, Portland, and Philadelphia that had been announced and released, I think it was April last year. You probably would have all seen the Time article that came out around that time about Amsterdam reinventing capitalism and a whole bunch of other hyperbole. And so we had this session and everyone's like, this is exciting. How do we do this? How do we actually localize this methodology to Australia? And people put their hands up around that masterclass to start convening. And that's sort of the genesis of Regen Melbourne, but also of small groups in other parts of Australia. So I guess I tell you that story because I think it's relevant to the unique position of privilege that I found myself in, sitting in an organization which had thought about this stuff for a long time, but also then gave me permission to explore this as part of my work. And I was able to put my hand up and say, yep, I can sort of start convening around this question of Doughnut economics in Melbourne by virtue of the fact that I sat in an organisation which thought that was important. So it wasn't something that I had to do, with the 10% of my time outside of work hours. I was able to dedicate some serious time to it. So I just wanted to give you that context before I dive into Regen Melbourne. Does that make sense? Just make sure I haven't lost people. Still got you. Excellent. David, I like your background. I'm assuming that's not real, but it'd be great if it was. So I guess I wanted to give you that snapshot, but then also I can sort of take you on a bit of a journey through the Regen Melbourne experience. I did just want to have a little bit of a sense from you all as to your level of understanding of Doughnut economics, and not just take that as an assumption. Could I maybe get like a snapshot either in the chat from like, I've only just heard of it because of this talk, through to I'm already a member of the Doughnut Economics Action Network in Europe, or I've read the book, or I've read an article, just a snapshot. Maybe in the chat, if anyone wants to unmute, you can do that too. Read about it in 2040. Yep, that's a really important starting point for a lot of people. The inclusion in the film. Read about it, read the book, some of the book, know a bit about it. Okay, this is helpful. This is great. Okay, so what I might do, if that's the case, is just do David Everett is a nope. Is that like, nope, I haven't read it? David? Okay, we can take that too. I like that. So I'll give you like a little snapshot to start with. Does that sound good?
Yeah, excellent.
And then I'll talk about how we applied that in Melbourne. And then as we said, I'd love just to have an open conversation about it. So I'll share my screen and let's just see if you guys can all see it. Happy? Great, that's Melbourne. So Kate Rayworth is an economist, as many of you would know. She's at Oxford now, or lives in Oxford, and does a lot of work out of that university. But she has been talking about the donut for a long time, long before the book was written and released about 5 years ago. So she was working at Oxfam for a long time in microfinance, working in Africa, also worked as part of groups that were working on the Sustainable Development Goals before they were released. And it was around that time that she was really interested in this idea of changing the goal of economics. She realized there was some fundamental issue at the heart of economics that was more than just how do we apply it, or how do we, think about the symptoms. There was something fundamental to the discipline that needed reform. And so she started to draw it. She actually speaks a bit about the fact that she was really struggling to write these ideas down. And then she realized that the power of images was actually one of the most important things that guide decision-making and ideas landing in people's psyche. And in particular in economics, there are certain graphs in economics, as many of you would understand, that live long in the memory after first year or second year undergraduate economics. And they were the ones that needed to be really examined and rethought. And so she started drawing these diagrams and she came up with this donut. And this was then used as part and informed the process of the SDGs, and was quite influential in many circles well before the book was released, as I said. But it's sort of important to start there, I think. And so the donut itself is the first of 7 principles that she talks about in the book. So it's the hero image. It's the one everybody understands. It's obviously where the title comes from. But it's also important to note that it's only one of these seven points. And so the donut itself is this inner layer, which is a social foundation, which is made up of the SDGs. This is basically lifted straight from the SDGs, and those 12 foundations come out of there. And then the outer ring, which is the ecological ceiling, are these planetary boundaries, which are developed by many people, including people out of the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which you'd be familiar with, which represent, the ecological barrier that we live in, whether we like it or not. And she realised, of course, that in order for us to have a conversation about reforming economics, we needed to shift the goal. We needed to agree on a new goal that wasn't just growth for growth's sake, and it could sort of be, we could talk about the how and debate that forever and a day, but we needed a new mission. And the mission was to get society, get our communities, get our cities, get our countries into this safe and just space for humanity, which sits in between the social foundation and this ecological ceiling. So it's quite a simple form. It's not new science or new economics. It's adopting relatively consensus held positions. All the countries of the world agree on the SDGs. Most people agree on these planetary boundaries, certainly scientists do. So this is taking consensus-based science and economics and applying it and reframing it, and then of course mirroring it back to everyone in a way that they can understand and hold on to. And it was really this idea that economics itself kind of needs reimagining and perhaps recapturing from forces that we can perhaps talk about at length in the Q&A. So that lands for everybody, yeah? We all understand that as a simple principle. But as I said, there are 7 ways that she talks about rethinking economics, and they're all important. And in fact, some of them are possibly even more fundamental at a philosophical level than the donut itself. So the first one, as I said, is to change the goal. So to move away from a conversation where GDP is the only measure of success, it's the only way we think about progress, towards this idea of a mission to get the world into the donut. The second one is around seeing the big picture, or reframing how we interpret the economy. So we live in a society that over the last 40 to 50 years under a neoliberal economic paradigm has sort of focused the idea of the economy down into the market. So the idea is the economy equals the market. Now, and that's sort of an isolated thing. Of course, Kate recognizes the truth in the matter, which is that the economy isn't just about the market. It's also about the state, it's about the commons, and it's about the household. So it's not to say that the market isn't part of the economy, but it is only one part of it. And then she lands that economy in the middle of what she calls about as the embedded economy. So that economy made up of those 4 parts, the household, the commons, the state, and the market, sits within society, which sits within the environment. Super simple concept, which we all agree on, it's common sense, but that's not how the market or the economy is currently sort of taught to people in economics, but certainly not even understood at a mainstream level. And on the left there, you see that the classic diagram of capital flows through a market, which is basically what people learn in their first year of economics, and it never leaves. So there's a zooming out role there. And I actually think that's a really critical one in the work of Regen Melbourne, and perhaps one that's missed in many of these conversations around how do we actualize the work of the Doughnut Economics model. And that is the inclusive nature of the conversation to include all 4 of these parts of the embedded economy. This is not a conversation just for civil society in the commons. It's not a conversation just for business, and it's certainly not a conversation just for the state. And when we talk about what Regen Melbourne is all about, it is trying to be inclusive of that whole embedded economy and include members and conversations and forums that talks to all of those aspects. So that's a critical one, just to perhaps emphasize that point. And then we can sort of go down the page, and feel free to jump in, because I don't want to talk exclusively. If people have thoughts they want to jump in on. The third one is a more of a psychological question, I think, and Kate talks about this a lot, where we appreciate actors in our economy as rational economic men, which is how economics was built. The whole profession was built on that idea, when in fact we are not just self-interested, selfish creatures. We know this to be true. Clearly, this group is an expression of that not being true. We're adaptable, we're sociable, we're altruistic. We see in a time of COVID and in a time of bushfires, of course, this is fundamentally true. Again, she's not saying that the role of a self-interested actor is not part of who we are, all of us as individuals, but it should certainly not define how we're perceived by the economy. We are much more complex than that, and our economic systems need to appreciate that complexity. Have I still got you? I can only see some of you on the screen, so I'm like just checking in. I can expand that so I can see you all. Great. I'll keep going. Yeah, happy? Okay. So number 4 speaks to this question of mechanical equilibrium. So we appreciate our economy in the paradigm of the 20th century as a machine. We all have been taught this, a machine with levers that we can pull and things that we can change to make the machine do different things or be more efficient, perhaps. And the reality, of course, is that these simple analogies fail when it comes to talking about something as complex as an economic system. We understand this to be true if we think about the most complex system we would all intuitively understand, which is our body, the human body. It's a complicated system. There's not a simple thing you can do that changes something else without other things being affected. So there's sort of a simple analogy there that we can start to think about. We're treating our bodies in all of its complexity. We also have to treat our economy in all of its complexity. And so she's talking here about complicated feedback loops. And the reality is that we need to use systems thinking for this work, not the simple 1 + 1 of economics. So there's a systems thinking aspect that she's introducing here with number 4. Number 5 and 6 are similar, but they relate to different parts of this economic equation. One is around this idea that designing, we need to design to distribute. So we were told all through the 20th century, and in fact, many people would say this is still public policy in many, many, many places around the world, but that if we go for economic growth, all the questions we have around inequality will even up over time. So this idea that growth will even it up. This is classic trickle-down economics, which you'd all be very familiar with. And interestingly, I think most people now agree is total bullshit, including public policy makers. Particularly, I think there was a press conference where Joe Biden was asked about trickle-down economics and he declared it dead. It's a couple of months ago. Now, these are small kind of changes when perhaps what we need is radical change. So I'm not saying that we've moved beyond this paradigm, but it's interesting to start to appreciate how broken some of these aspects are, despite it being mainstream public policy still. So clearly what Kate's talking about here is that we need to design economic systems that are distributive and that don't rely on this principle of growth evening it up again. And on the day that the IPCC released their latest report, number 6 is very pertinent, which is around this idea that growth will do the same thing, but for the environment. So by designing for growth, we'll basically clean up our economies as we get more and more wealthy. Now, there is an argument to say that that is partially true, but the argument that it is fully true or even anywhere near true enough is also clear. The idea that growth will clean up our economies to such an extent that we can mitigate the climate emergency is, again, a falsity. So the idea here is to build economies that are regenerative by design. And to your point, Mandy, hard to pronounce, therefore we call it regen. So that's the number 6. And then number 7 reflects back on number 1, which is this idea that we are entirely growth addicted. And this is a massive issue. And this is not just at an economics level. This is I think it permeates all of society. It speaks to consumption. It speaks to how we run our businesses. It speaks to a scarcity mindset in non-profits. It speaks to a whole bunch of things that is not just about other people being growth addicted. This is something that I think we all have to grapple with at an organizational level, at a personal level. And clearly what Kate's speaking about here at an economy-wide level is that in some cases, growth is not a bad pursuit, or it shouldn't be seen as a negative outcome. But we should be growth agnostic. This is not designing economies to grow. This is designing economies to thrive. And if they thrive and grow, then that's okay. But if they grow without thriving, then we've got serious issues and we produce all the externalities which we're now grappling with as communities. So that's the sort of 7 principles that she lays out in the book, which, again, I'd highly recommend reading, because every time I go back and look at stuff, I see new things. So there's a lot in there. How are we going? I'll stop sharing just for a minute because I'm conscious of my own voice. Does anyone have any thoughts, reflections, questions? Has anything come up in the chat that we should chat about?
Stephen?
Yeah, Stephen.
Oh, no, I wasn't going to say. I was going to say probably more than half of us have read the book, I think.
Yeah, great.
So that might explain why there aren't any immediate questions from the summary, because people have read it. We've also had a book club.
Ah, cool.
About the book, which Meg ran, and somebody else who is actually doing a talk somewhere else this evening, so isn't on the call, ran. Phil might have. I don't know whether Phil. We've got one of Australia's leading ecological economists on the line as well. His name is Philip Yawn. I can't see him at the moment, so he might have popped out of the room or something. Are you there, Phil? Maybe not. Maybe he popped out. No, that was absolutely terrific.
Hi, Phil.
That was a great summary, I think, of the first part of the book. And for those who haven't read it, and some of us haven't read it, I think that was terrific. Thanks very much, Kaj.
No, my pleasure. And I guess it is that what I'm being particularly interested in is the aspects of the book that have remained very active in conversations around the community organising we're now doing. There are certain principles there that I do think, we keep coming back to, which perhaps could be helpful in conversations around, lessons that you can learn around Adelaide or other parts of Australia that we might be calling in from. And Meg agrees that bullshit trickles down, which I'm glad we have some agreement over. So do you want me to tell you the story of Regen Melbourne then, from the point at which we had that masterclass? We're now on the same page around Doughnut Economics. Excellent. So I'm going to reshare again. And again, please do jump in if you'd like to. And I will happily take questions as we go. No need to wait around till the end if you don't want to. Okay, so we got together and started doing some really informal convening off the back of that masterclass. So there are a couple of organisations, Small Giants Academy being one of them, but Circular Economy Victoria, the Coalition of Everyone, started just basically calling out to our community saying who wants to be part of this conversation. Remember, we were in deep second lockdown in Melbourne, so we were all at home. Some of us had two-year-olds crawling around our ankles. And so it was a very strange time. And also, we'll speak about this again later, I'm sure, incredibly influential and important aspect of this story. The solidarity that came out of being in lockdown for a long period of time speaks straight through the pages of the report that we released, and is certainly still powering the energy of the conversations around Regen Melbourne. So it's a big part of the story. And in some of these informal gatherings, we've talked about, I guess, two major approaches that we could take to exploring this together. The first one was to do a similar thing that was done in Amsterdam and Portland and Philadelphia, which is basically to make friends with people in power. So work out who had relationships to Lord Mayors or people in the state government, and work out who we could influence around this idea of Doughnut Economics, and try and find a way to get this implemented or at least experimented with through the bureaucracy and the politicians. That was a really active pathway of exploration, because that was what was done in Amsterdam and in other places where the donut has been explored. People are friends with the mayor and they have a conversation, someone reads it, and suddenly it becomes this sort of whirl of energy that comes very much from a top-down perspective. The second way, which is the pathway we ended up taking, was to say, instead of importing a model from another part of the world, also relevant given our colonial history, to import an idea from the UK, and instead of doing that and then just trying to do a top-down approach, we should start thinking first about how community responds to the model and what type of adaptation or changes or insights could be garnered by having a community conversation using the donut methodology. And I think that was always probably the approach we were going to go down, but the depth of the second lockdown and municipal elections across Victoria also played a role. There was no political energy for this conversation, and there probably still is a bit of a hesitation, I think, even now, given the turbulence of the time, to have conversations like this. Stephen?
I just thought I'd add, we have sort of tried that first approach and got nowhere very much with it, with local councils, with the Greens. For the reasons you were saying, really, the councils tell you we're doing all this already.
Yeah.
When of course they're not. And the Greens, basically, I need to worry about keeping my job in the next year, and we haven't got space to do that. So it's great to hear the other approach.
Yeah, I also think, and I'd be interested in people's perspectives on this, people who had a lot more experience than I have in Australian politics, perhaps, but a mentor of mine talked about the fact that Australian progressives are pretty crap at visionary work. We're really good at problem solving, or historically have been, but the idea of large sweeping visions is not necessarily our strength. When you compare to, when my father was from in Sweden or Northern Europe, where, the Swedish foreign minister talked about a feminist foreign policy about 10 years ago. Now, to even imagine a Labor Party foreign minister speaking in those terms is almost laughable. We would have remembered, all of us, when the Shadow Treasurer stood up and talked about wellbeing economics just before the pandemic hit, and was laughed out of town by Josh Frydenberg in one of his most, I think, atrocious moments in federal parliament, and that's probably saying something. So the moment that these ideas are start to be floated, there is a significant response from the political establishment that I think we just have to know is there. It's not to say that we don't eventually end up in that conversation, but I think the political reality is, and we can talk about the balance between tactic and strategy perhaps later in the session, but it is a big part of the thinking as well. So we ended up going the other way, which is so much more fun too, right? So we decided to partner up with the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, which is a large community foundation that was originated in Melbourne and now does work in many places. And they were really interested in pursuing this experiment. So they gave us a small amount of money, $35,000, which may sound like a lot, but isn't a lot when you compare it to the work that was achieved, I think. And we also managed to work with the resilience team at City of Melbourne, which was a really important aspect, not because of the funding they provided, which was much smaller than LMCF's, but largely the importance of buy-in from some level of government. Not buy-in from the sense of like you now have a mandate to do something, but when you're doing, I guess what we found when we were doing the community engagement initiative or the activities, there was an ability to talk to people about this landing somewhere in a decision-making world. So the importance of saying that the work, the insights you're generating, the community conversations we're having, the report will end up landing somewhere where we can have influence. That was a really important part of it, I think, and people felt a sense of, that was important to people, I think. So having LMCF and the City of Melbourne alongside the three of our kind of community organisations was a really interesting and important mix. So we got together, the five of us, we designed this research process. And as you can see, these organisations are all now part of the work, but it started with the five organisations I mentioned. And we designed a community research process, which is not particularly revolutionary, but I guess integrated kind of basic community engagement principles with the Doughnut methodology, which I'd love to talk about a bit more. So the blue bubbles here are the 5 key community forums that were built and framed around the Doughnut Economics methodology itself. And I'll get back to that in a minute. We also did a suite of leadership interviews with a bunch of Melburnians that had very different perspectives and backgrounds, but held positions of influence in Melbourne in various communities. And then once we generated our sort of preliminary insights, we then held a series of targeted roundtables where we convened particular segments of community in Melbourne, not in order to get a representative sample. This was not a representative exercise, as is said very clearly in the disclaimers at the front of the document. This was more about following early adoption energy. And so those roundtables are really a way for us to say, this is what we found, what do you guys think? So as you can see there, we held with a series of communities in Melbourne. We held one with the New Economy Network of Australia, which you're all probably familiar with. We also convened a bunch of economists, both mainstream and people who would call themselves renegade economists, in a room to talk about the work that we were doing and the Doughnut model and what people thought about that, which was a fascinating exercise. And then we had a team of about 25 volunteers who, in a beautifully collaborative and collective way, distilled the insights from the report and then produced the collateral, which you may all have seen. And the report itself was launched at the end of April by Kate and the Lord Mayor of Melbourne. And since that report was released, a whole bunch of things have happened, which I can also talk to. So what I maybe want to just dive into a little bit, if you're interested, is just to talk a little bit about those 5 workshops and how they used the methodology. And then the 3 really important artifacts that came out of the research, which are now speaking to what happens next. So you may have read the city portrait methodology work that came out of Amsterdam and Philadelphia and Portland, which is on the left. That's now been updated, but it's still I think it's a really influential and important document, which is on a website somewhere, and I can put it in the chat later. But what this does is asks a series of key questions that communities need to explore in order to take what is a very macro model and downscale it to a city. As I mentioned, the model itself, the original model, uses the SDGs, it uses the planetary boundaries work. It's all really easy to agree with because it's sort of common consensus globally. But when you take this to a city scale, you start to see how the SDGs, as an example, start to fracture a little bit around the edges. They don't encompass all the things we would like them to encompass. Things like gender equality are explicitly called out in the SDGs, so that's part of the Doughnut. But other forms of inequality aren't necessarily explicitly called out in the SDGs because it varies from place to place. So as soon as you take the model that's designed for the whole and take it to a place, there's a series of adaptation that needs to happen, which, by the way, Kate recognized very early on in the model design. She said this when we talks about playing with this model, we have to be open and free to allow people to do so. Which is a very different approach to, when other people come up with frameworks that are very successful to hold and control. Kate's always very much been take it and play. And I'm sure if you've Googled and had a look around, there are lots of different interpretations of the Doughnut, which are many and varied. So it takes this model, it asks a few key questions that the city can explore, and it also breaks down the donut in a slightly more granular way. So on the right there, there's a wheel which speaks about 16 different elements of the social foundation. So now we've gone from 12 originally, now we're talking about 16 different foundations, which go to a little bit more granular level, which help you navigate it at a city level. And then they're grouped in these 4 areas, which you might remember is exactly what we've talked about in these 5 workshops. So these 5 workshops speak to these areas of an empowered, healthy, enabled Melbourne. And then the 5th one, of course, is ecologically healthy, which is the next layer out. It's the ceiling that we spoke about earlier. So what that actually manifests as for us with these 5 workshops. So in the Healthy Melbourne workshop, we asked people questions like, what is your vision for a healthy Melbourne? We started super macro, super lived experience design process. So we asked people, what is your lived experience of a healthy Melbourne? What is your lived experience of an unhealthy Melbourne? What are the barriers that you have felt towards living in a healthy city? So we started at the very top of that sort of general category. And then we went down into water, and we went into food, and we went into health, and we asked people questions at that level as well. So same sort of questions. What is your experience of a healthy Melbourne in regards to water? When do you feel healthy in and around water? And people would just share all these different things, and we put them all on these really fun interactive Miro boards, because this was all on Zoom, remember? These workshops were with between probably 70 and 100 people at a time. And so we had these breakout rooms, we had Miro boards, we had 10 co-facilitators in each session, and we generated these insights, which of course we had a graphic scribe come in and do lots of nice work around. And we did this 5 times. We had all the leadership interviews, and then we had the round tables where we presented the insights back. And I wanted to share with you, I guess, the 3 sort of anchor insights, anchor artifacts that are now came out of that process. So we had dozens and dozens of vision statements that the community produced. So they produced them on the macro level, like what is a healthy Melbourne? What is your vision for a healthy Melbourne? And then we also asked them, what is your vision for food in a healthy Melbourne? So we had all these different vision statements produced by lots of people, massive spreadsheet. And then we went through an exercise, again, with that group of sort of 20, 25 conveners that we had. We all looked at it from different angles. We grouped things in different ways. We found themes. We elevated really commonly held words. And this was the kind of co-created collaborative vision statement that came out around what is a regenerative Melbourne? What is our goal here as a community? And a couple of interesting things about these words. One is that I think they're quite beautiful. Like I think they really are, they land with me at least at an emotional level, not just a practical level. The second one is that they integrate the natural environment through each of these statements. So there isn't a standalone statement around the natural environment. We believe Melbourne should have a thriving ecosystem. Instead, all these aspects or attributes of a regenerative city include the natural environment weaved through them. So under knowledge, we are talking about access to knowledge as custodians of our environment, primarily. In a city that's full of life, we're talking about thriving natural systems where we can swim as part of that kind of aspect of living in a city that's full of life, which you can also interpret around culture, for example, and going out for dinner. So it's all integrated as one. And then you can see that speaks to all of them. And then there is an aspect of this vision statement, which is about the how, which is also really important. So the 6th one here, we want Melbourne to be an enabled place, is that the economic and the governance systems that we have enable our vision to come to life. It's not only a mechanical aspect of our society, it has to speak to the values and the vision that we have as a community. And so there are a few things that kind of came out of that process, not necessarily by design, but that I think are actually really important for what happens next, which I can come to in a moment. So the first artifact out of the research, out of that 70-page document, which some of you may have flicked through, or even the highlights document, this is the first really important artifact that came out of that process. The second one, of course, is the hero image that you may have seen, which is this Melbourne's adapted donut. So you've got Kate's on the left, ours on the right. And again, not only is it beautiful, I think, in the way that our designer and artist drew it, but there are a number of aspects that make it quite important. One is that in all of the sessions that we had, there were some common themes that came out. So when we had a session on health or empowerment or enablement, there was a common theme around art and culture, which came up again and again and again and again, which basically spoke to, you know, our health as a city is dependent on the health of our art and culture. Just came up again and again, and it couldn't be ignored. And it certainly couldn't be ignored in the version of the Doughnut that we produced. And so one of the segments of the Melbourne Doughnut is explicitly calling out art and culture as an important part of reaching a social foundation for our city. There's also a couple of other minor changes in the circle around freeing up a couple of the more complicated words into two categories. So mobility and access to information is combined as networks in Kate's Doughnut. And particularly access to information, we thought was something that needed to be called out because it speaks to the multilingual aspect of Melbourne. It speaks to the access to ICT infrastructure, which is clearly critical to a thriving city. It speaks to a number of things that perhaps weren't as important 5 or 6 years ago in a slightly less multicultural place, but it certainly is in a city like Melbourne. And then there are some perhaps design changes and word changes that are fundamental and speak to an essence of the city, we think, which are around this idea of healing and reconnecting to country and to each other. On the one hand, they're just words. On the other hand, they speak fundamentally to the kind of values that the network now wants to hold on to tightly. And that is that this is not a scientific and a technical exercise alone. For anyone who's, you know, you've all worked in, perhaps in this space much longer than I have, you'd appreciate the importance of the relational dynamic in particular when it comes to work that's fundamentally informed by science and economics. And so we wanted to call that out because we're not going to achieve a social foundation as a city if we don't fundamentally connect or reconnect to each other as human beings, not as individual consumers, as the way that the kind of current economic paradigm paints us. And in a similar way, we're not going to reach or get within that ecological ceiling if we don't fundamentally reconnect to country and nature. And clearly there are you know, First Nations philosophy and knowledge that we can speak to in that realm. But it's also something that I think we can all feel and have felt when we talk about, you know, coming up in those workshops, when do you feel most healthy? The most common response is, you know, when I'm walking along the river, or when I'm in the water surfing, or when I'm in nature. So it's something that we all feel and need to tap back into. So that ring speaks to those relational aspects, and it also speaks to a dynamic system. So the Doughnut on the left can feel quite flat, can feel quite technical. Doughnut on the right is meant to speak to that kind of dynamism and movement. So this is the second artifact out of our process, and is actually the mission statement of the network. So this is the vision. This is the vision of Regen Melbourne. This is the mission. The mission of Regen Melbourne is to get Melbourne into the safe and just space for humanity defined by our Doughnut. Now, how we do that and how we measure that, that is a great conversation we should have when we talk about what comes next. But this serves as a mission statement for the network. And the last aspect, and then we can, I'm happy to sort of pause and have questions and discussion, is the roadmap that was produced as part of this process. So in the work that we were doing, there was constantly a question of what happens next. You know, what is this actually leading to? And we jotted down ideas as they came up in workshops or project people were working on that they thought could be integrated. And ultimately, when we came to the end of the research process, there was this kind of organically produced, co-created roadmap of things that the community wanted to do next. It's not a strategy. That's what we've been working on since the report was released. But there is a sort of interesting theme here around how do you start the process of a pathway towards a more regenerative city and a network that might facilitate that. And the first 4 steps of the roadmap speak to the Doughnut. So it speaks to the how of this. You know, if we want to make this the mission, then we have to put some flesh on the bones, or whatever analogy you might want to use, around how we measure these things. How do we convene the right people, the right institutions around work that is already being done to interpret the SDGs or downscale the SDGs, or speak to the moral and the scientific responsibility we have to our planetary boundaries in a city context. There's lots of work that's been done in these areas. Many of you are involved in that sort of work. And the goal of this first section of the roadmap is to start convening existing work in this space, with the goal being that inside the next 2 years, we can aggregate that work and represent it to the Melbourne community through the lens of the Doughnut. And we think that could be an incredibly powerful way to start a conversation about new measures of progress for the city. And I'm happy to talk about that some more, but that's the first group of roadmap steps. The second one is this continuation of community activation. So there's a sort of a desire to do this work more and more deeply and more representatively. at different altitudes. So there's communities in Melbourne, Regen Moreland or Regen Peninsula or Regen Wyndham, city councils and LGA regions in Melbourne who are already starting to organise in similar ways that Regen Melbourne did, but doing it at a more local scale. And so we think that there's a role to play for Regen Melbourne to support that work to happen, to nurture that work, to share learnings, to share models, to share spreadsheets, and support that type of engagement work. And we also think there's a role for local councils at some point here. How we enroll local councils is a really interesting question for conversation. And then the last 4 steps of the roadmap speak to the network itself, which is what I've been spending most of my time on for the last couple of months, which is how do you set up a distributed governance structure? How do you set up a backbone function that's funded? How do you keep the momentum going in an era where modern philanthropy doesn't tend to fund the space in between? We fund projects, outcomes, outputs, and we're trying to find a new way to create, I guess, a new piece of community infrastructure here that can achieve and support the work that we're talking about, which is really around systems level collaboration. How do we improve that in our city? So that's what the roadmap speaks to. So just to recap, 3 artifacts are the vision statement, the donut, which represents our mission, and the roadmap, which sets us off on a pathway towards something that goes beyond just a piece of research. It goes towards a community organising model that can last way longer than this work. They're the 3 aspects that came out of the work, and that's, I guess, the little story that that we've been through. And I'll pause because I've now been talking again for a while. I'd love to hear any immediate reflections. I'm obviously happy to answer questions, and I haven't seen the chat, so we can go there as well. But any reflections? So curious to hear what you think.
I've got a few things to say.
Tully, please kick us off.
Hi, my name's Tully. I work in the arts. I'm an academic at Flinders University, and I'm a cultural policy researcher. And for the last few years, I've been I work with Justin O'Connor, who has been, yeah, right. So he's at Uni SA, but we are kind of on the same page. But for the last few years, I've been working on a project on the notion of value, which is looking at particularly how the arts and culture sector are, how value works with them, how over the last 40 years of neoliberalism, arts and culture have been required to always demonstrate their value according to a very narrow set of measures and understandings, and how it's become apparent that those measures don't work for arts and culture or for anybody. And actually, so some of the findings that we have out of that project are things like, so we've got the whole notion of value is corrupted as a file and needs to be, deleted and reinstalled, because we've got, all of the, that we can't get back to a good notion of value from the position that we're in right now because of what's happened to it over the last 40 years. So that's one perception. But there are a couple of other things there. One is looking at your, I think the work that you've done is great, and I'm just so compelled by this idea that arts and culture kept coming up for you. I think that is such a fascinating story to tell about how people deal with systems like and processes like the one you've been discussing. But looking at your roadmap, and one of the bottom one of the first tranche of work in the roadmap is data and measurement and indicators. And I put it to you that is part of the problem of how we got into the mess that we're in. So it's not actually, so maybe just like this problem of value that I'm trying to solve for arts and culture, which has been so corrupted you can't get back to a proper sense of value from where we are, I am very skeptical that anybody can come up with a set of indicators, etc., for something positive, because that whole process of its very nature has to collapse distinctiveness in order to create commensurability, in order to create data and indicators. And I think that is a process that eats itself, essentially. and gets us on a wrong path. But that's my opinion.
No, I see. We do need a fire and a bottle of wine. Like that's the only way. The only way we really have this conversation. I agree largely. I think, and I think I guess there's a couple of reflections on that. One is that from the world that I have lived in for a while, which is the world of impact investment, social finance, social enterprise, social business. This is it's a really hot button topic, and it's a tide that we've tried to fight against for a long time, which is that really all we need to be doing in order to shift the dial is to produce an impact statement that looks a bit like a P&L. And if we can do that, then we convince people that they need to invest differently, and Bob's your uncle, the world changes. Obviously, that's horse shit, and appropriates a lot of the neoliberal economic paradigm and applies it to a different space. I agree wholeheartedly to that. And the way we have often spoken about it, and I think an aspect of this that I do think is really important, is that there is a poetry and a grammar to measurement. There is a grammatical aspect which speaks to the reality of the systems that we're currently in, which is often required to allow people to walk across a bridge to something new. And that is, they can actually understand the language, right? Like they can follow the sentence structure that you're talking about. But if you leave out the poetry aspect of this question, which I think goes to what you're talking about, which is, an essence or a distillation of what's happening, it speaks to plurality, it speaks to things that are not perhaps understood or understandable in the way that our current system defines that, then you are bastardizing the whole process. And I think that should apply to the conversations we're having around, how do we convene an appropriate conversation around art and culture and the health of art and culture in our city, just as much as it speaks to the health of income and jobs in our city. And I think that complexity needs to be applied across the elements of, the Melbourne donut in our case, in order to have a mature conversation around how do we measure progress differently. But to ignore the grammatical aspect of this, I think is as bad a mistake as the opposite, because I think it just allows people not to be in the conversation. And I think that, the thinking about that classic round table of economists that we had about 6 months ago now, which I do wish I'd recorded and could share with you all. We had, the chief economist from two of Australia's largest banks. And we also had, some extraordinary maverick or renegade economists that I've looked up to for a long time in the same room talking about Doughnut economics. And there was a generalized agreement on point 1 of the 7 points, right? That the current measure of progress is broken and we need a new one. Now, we then had vigorous debates around whether the neoliberal economic paradigm could achieve that new goal or whether it needed to be broken down completely. And I love that. That's a great conversation to have. But there was an ability to get to a place of agreement on a shifted goal, which I think is actually a huge, huge step in the right direction. What do other people think? I'm so curious.
Bit of a tangent from the direction Tully was taking, but although we could come back to that, but I just wanted to mention the hark back to Phil's work on the genuine progress indicator, which is obviously a single measure that could be used by governments in the same way as GDP is used now, which I think there's a bit of support for here in Adelaide. We've certainly got some interest from one of our more progressive councils to commission a GPI, genuine progress indicator, for their local area, and potentially we might have the support of the Torrens University for that kind of work as well, which is really exciting. So I guess hopefully end up with the same outcomes, just via a different pathway. But also really keen to explore what would it take to have Adelaide as a regen Adelaide. What kind of what do we need to actually kick that off? And could we be the group that does it, or could we prod some other people into doing it. Yeah.
I mean, maybe, can I share with you, I'll share my screen just once more, because I think just to make the point around measurement, and there are lots of like the Australian National Development Index. They're really interesting examples, I think, of or an understanding of the need to shift the measurement conversation. And I think we're tapping into a rich pedigree in that space. This is not to say this is a new conversation we're trying to lead. This is very much building on the shoulders of a lot of work that's come before. And just to speak to that question of the importance of localization, and I think it came up in the chat there a little bit around poverty levels and a few other things, which is what the macro donut speaks to. This is work that was put together by Leeds University and a few researchers in Europe, which basically took the donut model, took publicly available data, and did a kind of simple mapping of how countries are going. So you look at a country like Australia, and according to the macro statistics that are used at country scale, we're above the social foundation on all issues.
Yeah.
Which of course is, again, like not a true representation of our reality on the ground in terms of how we perceive social disadvantage in this country and the vast amounts of work that need to be done. So this is not enough. It's not enough to look at kind of baseline existing ways of measuring things. To your point, Tully, that is not a way of having this conversation. It's an interesting snapshot perhaps at a global level, because I can click over here and I can take Argentina and we can have an interesting conversation at how they are at a comparison level.
Yeah.
But it's not a good conversation to have at a city portrait scale or a downscaled city level. Although I would say on the ecological ceiling, this tells a damn good story. It tells the story of how much we are in trouble and speaks to our moral responsibility. So I just wanted to share that as well, because I think it's sort of part of this conversation. And I'll just put the link in here if anyone wants to have a play.
Thanks.
And Andrew, who's a big part of that research, now works for the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, which is a Doughnut team that Kate has put together in Europe.
Yes, I did sign up our group to be part of that. I just haven't had capacity to really dive deep into it yet, but hopefully in the future we can take a closer look at all those cool things, resources that are out there. Yeah.
David's question in the chat is around examples of where this has been applied. The simple answer is there aren't that many. This is still really emergent territory. There are examples which you can read about in some of the articles that have been written about Amsterdam and Philadelphia that speak to, for example, in Amsterdam, there's a big property project in the city which is looking at using the Doughnut system and the Doughnut methodology to track their entire project and the impact across both social and environmental aspects of that project. So there are experiments happening. And then, as you'll see, if you go on the Doughnut Economics Action Lab website, there's many coalitions all around the world forming in cities to play with the Doughnut. I guess I would say that it's still at the play stage. I don't think there's been a kind of, and it's not a critique, I think it's just where things are at. It hasn't been a maturing to the point of influential community organising, where this model can be put up as a serious alternative or can be demonstrated to have effects in certain sectors of the economy, for example. But that's sort of our challenge. I think that's all of our challenge. It's nice to produce a visual like this, and it's great conversation starter. And we can have conversations like this one about what we can do next. But I actually think it's what happens next that's the most important piece, and that's why I've been spending most of my time on both designing a kind of model for this and also raising money, because this can't continue on the collective efforts of a whole bunch of volunteers alone. This has to have some support at a kind of backbone level, and that's the sort of the story of successful place-based networks anywhere in the world. Have the common denominator is that there is sort of an independent nature to it, and there is also independent funding that supports not the projects but the convening. That's when you end up with a kind of momentum and a sort of a rethinking of where power lies. And ultimately, I think from knowing a little bit about your background and at the network, we're actually talking about the distribution of power in community and in our economic system. And I think if we're doing that, then we need new pieces of community infrastructure that can start to shift that.
On that topic, Can you talk to us a little bit about how First Nations groups were involved, and how did you reach out to them, and what was their response initially?
Yeah, absolutely. We had both kind of, I guess what you would call advisory group support. So kind of strategic conversations around the time and place that we're in, and how this intersects with that. And so, you know, Small Giants Academy has an elder in residence who's the senior elder of the Boonwurrung Foundation here in Melbourne. And Nawi Carolyn Briggs was involved in conversations about the project, but also interviewed as part of it. But we also had, I guess, support at a design level as well, which was in conversations with Professor Yin Parody, who's the chair of race relations at Deakin University, and he was sort of more around his insights are really around the nature of convening, and how that can be done. I guess, you know, the big asterisk that was on this work from the very beginning was that this was sort of 500 people, it was 45 organisations. This is not a representative piece of work, and we're not community engagement specialists and never claimed to be. This really was an expression of early adoption energy, and that was very clearly and explicitly called out through every step of the process. Now that we're talking about what happens next in terms of designing a network and you know, work streams, and then it becomes an even more critical conversation. But clearly it's very much built into the Doughnut methodology, and this is to Kate's credit, that, you know, when we're talking about the ecological, thinking about our ecological impact, it's very much framed as in what would happen if the modern society wasn't here. You know, how would our ecology be working if we weren't here? And therefore thinking about, you know, the way that First Nations have been custodians of our natural environment for tens and tens of thousands of years is an incredibly, like, what an incredible resource base to be having conversations with around this work. But there is a lot more to do. This is not me saying that we've got that part of the conversation sorted by any means. We're very much at the start of a journey.
I really like that framing about early adoption, because it kind of implies that other people will be joining this kind of tidal wave that's coming. So yeah, I love that. It's great.
It's very much an invitation to come and play at this stage. But we know that there's a time at which this emerges into a public consciousness where we need to be a little bit more conscious of, you know, that question of representation and how it plays out. And we're putting together an advisory board at the moment that starts to reflect that.
I'd like to make a comment, if I could, there. I'm interested in this idea of First Nations role in it. And I would encourage you not only to think of it as a justice issue for including their voices, but when we localize the Doughnut, my thinking goes that it's the local place that shapes the way we interact together on country in a place like Melbourne or in Adelaide. So it's partly that ability to learn what's special about this place from their knowledges, and then how to live with it. And, you know, that puts the Doughnut in terms of the ecological ceiling. So I'd be really keen to explore this. Here in Adelaide, the Kaurna people are known for belief systems such as the Jabruki dreaming, which is a peace story. It's a story of how to live together. So if you have a right to ask for that story or engage with that story, and you engage Kaurna leaders in bringing their views into our way of forming such a view, you could really create a very localized place-based way of doing this that would be very creative and different than other places. And just while I'm speaking, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. I found it really great to listen to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Freya. And I mean, I agree completely. I think it's a worldview question that I think we're teasing at, that you know, ultimately when we bear all this down, that's what we're coming down to at a fundamental level. You know, what is the aspect that we're coming at these questions with, and there are have been beautiful interpretations of the Doughnut from First Nations perspectives in a number of places around the world, including in New Zealand, where if you Google Maori Doughnut, you'll find an absolute inversion of the model, where they put the earth and the ecology at the center and they put the social elements on the outside. And instead of doing it as a circle, they did it as a spiral, a continuous spiral, which is just I guess it's an expression of what you're talking about, right? Like it's not it's a different worldview, and that's something that we should be trying to honour and integrating in the work that we're doing. And that's where I think we're speaking about all the documents and all the artifacts that we're working with as living documents. These are not static things. And as soon as we, re-engage at a community level, when the spring comes and we emerge out of winter hibernation here in Melbourne, we'll be having, re-looking at all of these as living documents.
There's a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Mandy's asked, where do you think the support to sustain this movement is most likely to come from? And Stephen asks, are politicians enthusiastic about this in Victoria?
So Mandy, we are having some success in philanthropic fundraising, which has been both fantastic and a little bit surprising by virtue of the sort of complexity of the idea. And I think that comes from an appreciation at the gap between people's enthusiasm for collaboration and their funding of it, which has come out in some research recently of philanthropy and foundations in Australia, which I'm happy to share, from the Menzies Foundation, which specifically speaks to the contradictions of collaboration and how there is this huge gap in Australia where everyone talks about it and no one wants to fund it. So that's been helpful. That framing has been really helpful in conversations that I've had, and we've got support from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, from a large environmental non-profit, from a couple of family offices and private foundations. And we have some interesting conversations over the next 3 or 4 weeks that I think will get us to the point where we can kind of open up and launch as an ongoing bit of community infrastructure for Melbourne. And that will be a really interesting starting point, but it is just a starting point because there's sort of a huge amount of work to do around what that really means and how we build the work streams that would sit around a backbone function. And there'll be a series of public conversations or workshops that we'll run with the community around, making sense of that together. We've already got a model that we're speaking about, but putting that in front of everyone, saying, what do you think and what do your organizations bring and how do you want to contribute? That's a very live conversation we'll be having between now and the end of the year. But that basically means that we can start talking about what does a mature city portrait look like over the next couple of years. How do we bring universities and institutions together around that concept, and how do we resource it appropriately? This is important work that needs to be valued, and the type of expertise we're talking about is, exceptionally valuable expertise. And unfortunately, again, in our economic system that we haven't been very good at valuing that. So we'd like to be part of a conversation around how we do that better as well. Long answer to say that it's actually going okay.
Fantastic.
And
That's
Stephen, your point around politicians, we haven't put our energy there yet. And I think, and I don't know if that's clever or really dumb, but in the sense that, perhaps early enrolment of politicians is a good thing because you can bring people on a journey, perhaps it's nice to come from a position of strength where community's in place and ready to roll. I was
wondering whether they'd actually initiated any contact with you rather than whether there'd been somebody who's put their head above the parapet and gone, I think this is a really good idea.
Yeah, look, we certainly had a lot of interest. And, as I said, Sally Capp, the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, opened the event where the report was launched. So it's not that people aren't aware that the work is in the world. This conversation on what happens next is very new, and that may well be a point at which people want to engage when they perceive it to be a more ongoing project rather than a nice summer research project, which was sort of nice to engage with but didn't require a lot of buy-in to put names against or be involved or seen at an event. So yeah, we'll see what happens in the next phase, but we'll see. I just reading Freya's comment in there about cafes as third spaces for filming and nurturing community. Couldn't agree more. I mean, it's Melbourne after all. But the other one I'd say, and the one I've been thinking a little bit about, is libraries and public libraries as being extraordinary opportunities for, I guess, for community engagement, but also just a kind of acknowledgement of their role and their unique role in our city, and I'm sure yours as well. So I think that's also, we can sort of start to speak to some of the institutions that perhaps have been little bit lost in some of the public narrative. Kerry's, you've also mentioned, just because you mentioned Jane Gleeson White, 6 capitals, I think that's a really relevant reference for many of these conversations. And, if you haven't read Jane's recent article on how the patriarchy of economics, yes, Tully shared it as well. I mean, a phenomenal article, just highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Mandy asked about, sorry, I'm sort of facilitating myself here. I didn't mean
No, that's okay. Go ahead. It's a conversation. Jump in.
Oh, yeah, but it's not a conversation with myself. That's a bit weird. The question, I've lost the question, hilarious. Resistance from any groups. No, because we haven't really said anything much, which again, I don't know if that's tactical or whether that's just where we're at. There's been some articles and, there's been some commentary on those articles. And certainly I think there is a valid critique of Doughnut Economics and, by the way, most alternative economics, which is that there's not enough economics in them. And that is an interesting critique that I think we have to grapple with, and where that might actually be a good thing, right? Because we're shifting the paradigm itself. We're not talking about the discipline of economics. But there's certainly, I think, there was a very distinct decision made early on. I remember the conversations vividly where we talked about how do we frame the community that was forming around this work? Do we frame it around the donut or do we frame it around the city? And there are many, as you will see on the Doughnut Economics Action Lab website, lots of coalitions around the world who talk about themselves as, the Doughnut Coalition of Amsterdam or the Doughnut Action Lab in, Philadelphia or whatever it might be. And we very consciously made the decision that this wasn't about the donut, that this was a community organising moment off the back of the biggest fires and natural disaster the country's ever seen, and off the back of the greatest economic disruption since the Great Depression. This was a moment for community to come together and to try and drive a shift towards a collaborative mindset and away from a competitive one. That was at the essence of what we were doing, and we were harnessing the solidarity that came from the most bizarre lockdown experience we couldn't have written, and saying this is the moment that we can harness. And the donut is the tool. Donut is the tool to have those conversations, but it wasn't what it is. And that means that this question of, and the critique that people have of models always, is one that's not actually that interesting to us. Because those who don't want to engage in the donut methodology, or think that well-being budgets are better, or think that whatever model is for them, it's very easy to maintain them in the conversation. And to say that's fine and valid, and as long as we agree on the vision that we've set for Melbourne, or the the mission to get into step 1 of the donut, not all 7 steps, but the step the new goal for the city, then let's talk about how we do it together. It allows for a shift of emphasis, I guess. And I think it was a really smart decision, because it's allowed us to have this conversation now of the work that has been produced using the donut is the work, but then there's this piece of community infrastructure that's sort of slowly been developing, and now we can talk about how to formalize it. That's sort of I guess part of the story of the last 9 months.
I'd like to just come back to the report itself and the artifacts that you talked about, and the visual beauty and the poetry that's contained in them, and what feedback have you got from people about being drawn into it because of those things?
Yeah, look, I think we had a really interesting, and this maybe speaks to your question around what is the perhaps the role for you all, or the lessons for a potential Regen Adelaide, or thinking about what could be done. And we're having conversations with about 10 cities and regions around Australia about the idea of replication or lessons that can be shared. And there's a Regen Sydney group and a Regen Brisbane group, and as I said, a number of regional areas as well. So it's kind of a live conversation happening very organically. And not to say that we've done everything right or doing anything right. It's more to say that it's a live conversation at the moment. And I guess part of that has been, the lessons that we learned around the visual work is clearly, it seems obvious, but the fact that we had visual scribes in the sessions meant that people who weren't there could feel what it may have been like to be there, which is just an important thing that you don't get from words on a page. And similarly, the donut itself, designed by extraordinary designer called Devon, her work really has made this stand out, not just from enrolling people in Melbourne, but also bringing that felt experience of what was done. And I think the weightiness of what was done to other parts of the world. So certainly been received really well. And I think that's allowed us to have a really interesting part of the global conversation around the model.
I love it. It's fantastic.
It's fun. And then you can produce nice postcards and, act professional on Zoom.
So good. A leaf out of Stephanie Kelton's book.
Exactly.
Kai, I've got a question for you. We were talking earlier, just before we started, about a lot of the sort of issues in the world today coming down to the problem of greed in society, and that's sort of coming to the fore at the moment. And we're wondering how to make greed as uncool as racism and sexism. How do you, is it possible to do that, to try and pull us all back from, some of the uglier economic growth that we're seeing at the moment? I'm thinking of housing. I'm thinking of just the inequality that's going crazy just now, even in Australia. Is it possible to do that? I don't know. We were talking about language and all sorts of things, but how do you perhaps, see that underlying message? I don't think it's something you can approach head on, but, I guess it's from a more positive way of looking at the good things that come out of collaborating and thinking of community rather than individual, which I guess is that, partly the work you're starting there.
Yeah, I think it's a big part of the work at a more philosophical level. And I think all the conversations I've been having about the sort of value of an ongoing Regen Melbourne model has been this idea that we're pretty good at collaborating in Melbourne, but it's within very defined spheres that actually reinforce the status quo. So just collaborating within food as part of the ecosystem is great, but it doesn't reform the way food intersects with power or with health or with housing or with other aspects of the economy. So I think the role here is to try and to expand what you're talking about to a more systems level aspect. But that's in terms of the donut work. I think that the point you're making, it reminds me of a couple of things. One, you will have possibly all read Tyson Yunkapora's Stand Talk, but it speaks a lot to that question of mind worldviews that underpin the values that we hold and we see and expressed in society through things like consumption and greed and other things. So I think there's some aspects of shifting worldviews that is required in order to grapple with that question. And the success of that book is heartening, that people can start to see value for themselves in doing that. And the other reframe that I really like, that again I think is becoming more and more relevant, again perhaps on a day like today when the IPCC report comes out and expresses what it does, it's perhaps important, but the idea of being a good ancestor. So it's not so much about not being greedy to the person who lives down the street. It's more about not being greedy to the generations to come, and to shift our what Roman Krasnarek, Kate's husband, talks a lot about in his book on this topic. He talks about the extension of empathy through time, not just through space. And so if we can start to do that, and we shift the kind of value systems that that we the idea of having an indicator that basically allows people to step across from GDP to GPI is perhaps a less of a bridge to cross than something a bit more complex that identifies many more of the indicators that we know are important. So I think it's an and I've made some notes, Phil. I'm going to probably follow you up in coming weeks to understand a little bit more as well.
I've just, so because a lot of people might look at the donut and they'll say, okay, so that's good and that's bad, but what does that really mean overall? And as imperfect as the GPI is, I'm not going to suggest for one moment that the GPI is perfect. It allows you to look at individual things, the donut model, but the GPI sort of gives you some overall picture of what's going on.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're
useful.
one of the things that we've been reflecting on is, what is the role or what is the purpose of a portrait of Melbourne? Like, what is the thing that happens after something like that is released? Partly, I think it's there's a potential here to have it as an annual reflection of the city that is produced by not an actor in the economy, but it's actually a neutral space that we're playing in together. So it's kind of a community-led response, a community-led mirror of progress in the city. But part of it is also goes back to that question of what is the challenge to the various aspects of the economy. So, if you think about back to that embedded economy model earlier of, what is the role of the commons, the state, the household, and the market, I think there needs to be a way to present progress in a much more mature way. And the Doughnut is perhaps one way to do that, as a kind of image that people can perceive and land and perhaps be on the front page of newspapers. But also with the challenge to those sectors of society to say, what is the government response here to the fact that we have gone backwards on housing, for example, but not to leave out the fact that there is a role for the commons in that conversation too, and there is a role of the household, and there's a role for the market. So to be able to hold the kind of integrated nature of the economy in response to a more mature measure of progress is also something I think that our network approach has the capacity to do in the future, or at least that's sort of an aspiration. And by having members of the network that are sort of part of those different aspects of the embedded economy, perhaps gives us a starting point for some of those conversations, or at least the potential for, purpose-led business, for example, to take a public stand on certain things, or progressive politicians to take certain stands on things, or, leading and perhaps more braver organizations in the commons to take a stand on certain things. So it sort of allows for that next step to happen that goes beyond just the publication of reports, which I think is, think tanks play a really important part in our ecosystem, but this is speaking to the collective.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what really to say. Yeah, so I agree with you. Yes. Just another point too. I think Mandy might have brought up the notion of the idea of whether you could sort of somewhere in the model have something that perhaps reflects or takes into account the impact of greed. If greed is something that's undesirable in modern society, I think it's been around for some time. It's been around forever, really. I think one of the benefits of all indicators, and something that always has to be remembered, and people might disagree with me on this, is that really what indicators do, and the Doughnut model itself does, is it measures consequences. It doesn't measure process. It measures and gives you an indication of the consequences of bad process, of which greed might be part of it. When the indicators don't look good, that's probably an indication, and one of them might be, growing income inequality, going backwards on housing affordability, social housing, and so forth. It may well be that one of the reasons for that is the fact that greed is and the fact that the economic system that through neoliberalism, which sort of almost embraces greed as if greed is good, the Doughnut model and the genuine progress indicator as well can indicate in a way that, of course, that GDP doesn't, the undesirable implications of neoliberalism, greed, and things like that. And so it can justify if things are going in the wrong direction. Firstly, it can indicate that what we've been doing in the past isn't working, and therefore can justify alternative approaches to the way we organise our economic, social systems, the institutions that form the foundation for society and the economy and so forth.
I agree. I think the thinking about what happens next, we're very interested in, as I've mentioned, that sort of research or sense making work stream, which will really be picking up this city portrait process and speaking to many of the things that you're talking about, and taking that kind of grammar and poetry approach to it, and trying to integrate all of that in, and bringing in the institutions that have already done a lot of work in this space. So there is a kind of work stream around that research and sense making to activate the Doughnut. But we are also talking about, what do projects look like, or beacon projects look like, that we can both support as a network. So the collaborative projects that we want to see come to fruition, but also, potentially look at interesting ways of funding opportunities that network can support to amplify those projects. There's also a storytelling aspect, work stream that's entirely around shifting narratives in Melbourne. What is success for Melbourne in the next phase post-pandemic? And then there's also this idea that I think you guys agree with, because otherwise you wouldn't run these sessions, is that there's value in the art of convening, which is critical if we are to build unique coalitions to tackle the challenges that we see. So we perceive Regen Melbourne's role as also holding forums that can sort of have some of these more complex conversations within them around what is regenerative business for our city, or what does reimagining the role of government and participatory democracy look like, and to land that in the city. So I guess today's conversation has spent, justifiably a lot of time on the model and on, the art and poetry and grammar of measurement and economics, but it's important to just emphasize the fact that it's also about these other aspects of building a new, community organizing methodology or piece of community infrastructure that involves other things, not just the measurement of something new.
Yeah. Although you really don't need indicators to, those sorts of things that you're talking about, collaboration within society, building up social institutions and collectives within society is something that is desirable without the need for indicators. But I think indicators, if those sorts of things do take place and they grow over time, then you would see the benefits of them with something like the Doughnut model. And we're seeing, because of what the Doughnut model and what the genuine progress indicator is indicating, is that we're not progressing, and it's pretty clear that if that's the case, then the current system that we have is failing, and it's failing in many ways. But one of them is the fact that there's been this increasing reliance upon individualism and less collective action, and not just at the government level, but at the community level. So this is where these indicators become important. That they ask a person on the street how they feel about things, and they'll say, well, things aren't really going for me and society as a whole the way it should be. But it's not always easy to verify that. These sorts of indicators, I think, can help do that. They can indicate why things aren't going as well as we'd like, and from an ecological point of view, it's potentially catastrophic, and therefore can help justify alternative approaches. And if they work, and I think they would work, we would see the benefits of those in these indicators, like the Doughnut model and the genuine progress indicator.
Yeah, agree.
I think that's the real value of the Doughnut model, is it gives us a picture of the way things are, and as that picture changes over time, whether we are progressing or not, and the genuine progress indicator, I think, giving a more overall measure of where we are, they can complement each other, and I think they provide greater ammunition for the need for change, and assuming that change occurs and it is beneficial to society, I think that would be reflected in these indicators in a way that, of course, is not indicated in the GDP, which, of course, apart from a shock to the system like a pandemic, seems it goes up, but of course there's no way you could say that the average Australian is twice as better off as they were probably 30 years ago when per capita GDP was half its current value. Just a few observations and comments.
Thanks, Phil. That's terrific. I'm so sorry. I completely dropped out for a good 2 or 3 minutes, and I didn't get the start of this conversation. But it sounds like people have been happy to continue as we went quite a bit over time. Sorry about that, Kaj. I hope that's okay. A couple of people have had to go for various reasons, but do we have any other quick questions before we wrap that people have been holding on to desperately? Stephen?
I do more a comment. I mean, I teach economics, and I find when I do courses, as some of you know, for members of the general public or low-level undergraduates, I usually focus on the donut. If I'm dealing with more advanced students, really partly because of the training they've had, I do discuss the same things, but focus more on the GPI. I think it's horses for courses, really. I think they should both be there. And maybe actually they, in a sense, converge in terms of the elements in a GPI. But that's how I use both of them.
Can I just say one last thing? Is that all right?
Yeah, go.
Yeah. I mean, I just went off on to sort of summarise, because some people ask whether or not indicators are particularly important. I think they are, and I think the donut model, as I said, if I plan to do some calculations, I might adopt a slightly different approach, but it will still be a donut type of approach. I might just have slightly different social indicators, and I might adopt a slightly different approach to the ecological foundations and the planetary boundaries type of approach, because I do have a little bit of a problem with the Leeds University approach. I won't go into it in any great detail, but indicators are important because they are necessary to support our position. If it's extraordinary, we put a human being on the moon in 1969, and yet when it comes to indicators of human progress, we still really haven't gone much further. Well, I think we have, but in a formal sense, we haven't gone much further than GDP, which was never designed to be an indicator of progress. And we need these indicators. We need to use them to indicate that the way we've been going has been failing, and to therefore support our position and where and how things should change in the future. And when and if those changes do occur, I'm pretty confident those indicators will move in a positive direction and continue to support what we're saying. They're very important, those indicators, and I think that sometimes we tend to forget how important indicators are. I mean, if you go to the doctor because you're not well, the first thing they're going to do is probably take your temperature or something like that. They're going to do something they're going to measure something to get an overall indication of your well-being. So we do rely upon indicators, and I think the donut model and what Regen Melbourne is doing and basing what it wants to do around the donut model is a wonderful step. That's all I want to say.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Maybe just my reflection, Gabby, sorry.
Yeah.
And it's a broader one, not because I agree. I mean, I do just come back to that, perhaps the point that Tally made, which I agree with around the way I framed it around grammar and poetry of measurement is also very true. So I think we can hold both things at once. And the way that I tend to do that, and it's just my way of thinking about it, and maybe it's the fact that I haven't recovered as an engineer perhaps as much as I thought I had, is that there is a kind of philosophy and a conversation that we should have around, I guess, red wine and fires. There is a strategy to the work that we're doing, and then there are the tactics that we need to implement to actually create tangible change on the ground. And I don't think we're at a time where we can afford to not play at all levels. And so the transition of Regen Melbourne from a piece of community research to a network of action is a critical piece. And it's not something we know the answer to. You know, none of us know how to do this stuff. It's all very emergent, but it's a time to take those steps and not to sit in, to not be okay with just doing the work that was done over summer that we've done. And I think there's an integration piece of the institutions that hold knowledge, universities, think tanks, with the community organising work that's also been going on for a very long time in sectors across the country and across the world. And it's time to sort of bring that together. And we find, and perhaps this is the inside out of the pandemic experience for Melbourne, that a connection to place is what binds us. That's the right scale to have this conversation at. And, you know, we can talk about indicators for a city, but we can also talk about connections to place. And that's really what's making this conversation have momentum. It's the fact that it's based at a scale that people can comprehend and feel a deep relationship to.
Thank you. That's a really lovely note to end on, I think. Thanks everyone for sticking around, and thank you so much, Kaj. It's such a great presentation. I'm really annoyed that my internet dropped out and I haven't captured the whole recording, but maybe we can use Mandy's backup. So
that was definitely the best bit, Gabby. That 2 minutes you missed, that was gold.
I bet.
Thanks for having me, everybody. Thanks for the invitation.
We would like to send you a gift. So can you please let us know your postal address and we'll pop something in the mail at some stage. And I won't do the usual sort of roundup of what's coming up, except to say we have a great talk, same bat time, same bat channel, 2 weeks from now on water policy failure in the Murray-Darling Basin with Professor Sarah Wheeler. So please all come along to that. And I will do a really good email with all the links that we've been talking about tonight and links to the report and to the GPI paper for South Australia and all of the good juicy stuff. So you'll all get it on an email as soon as I am able to get the talk up on YouTube. So shall we leave it there? And thanks again to Kaj. So great to hear from you. So inspiring. I love Regen Melbourne. It's just really been a pleasure to engage with.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Bye.